Most of the hatcheries in Washington were built a very long time ago, and much of it was driven by the belief that we could have more fish than we currently did, much of it for commercial commercial consumption. And when we significantly increased the hatcheries, we also increased the infrastructure for harvest. You know, many more commercial boats, larger scale gear, and it created a bit of a landslide of technology to harvest. They definitely are two stories that went on at similar times of gaining dimension.
The original thinking in the late 1800s and through the first half of this century was that, you know, you replace the damage that was being done by man, whether it be logging or dams or just population increases that are encroaching on that salmon's habitat. We could replace them, we could take the place of Mother Nature. And so we'd build hatcheries and had less regard for the damage we were doing to the natural environment.
And hatcheries went through a real boom for a long period of time, for decades, from the 40s and 50s all the way through the 70s. And then you start to see the values shift, particularly to, what is a salmon, or are they different? Do we have hatchery produced fish, and do we have naturally produced fish, and is there a distinction between the two, and is there a value to those?
And when I first started working with Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife back in the early 70s, I remember in one interview, one of the questions had to do with fish management. And I suggested that a good way to support fisheries management was to Johnny Appleseed hatchery smolts in the nearby stream, so that if there was over harvest and there weren't enough wild fish, just backfill them with hatchery fish. And that, at that time, that was kind of the thinking.
And so we kind of migrated out of those glory days of salmon fishing in the late 70s that we had in the early 80s, when we were the salmon capital of the world and everybody was catching fish, and we had to start, and we started valuing our individual stocks of fish. And when we started shifting there, that's when we had that need to start gathering information.
By the 1980s, 1990s, it was obvious that salmon, even with mitigation, that hatcheries still hadn't kept up the supply of salmon, and wild populations were disappearing, and stocks were being listed under the Endangered Species Act, and recovering salmon populations became a big thing, and preventing extinction became big.
And what happened in the 1990s was a response of this greed and overharvest and mismanagement that had occurred previously and had been exemplified in the 1980s. And that result led to dramatic returns that were very low in the 1990s, prompting a closer look by the federal government at what was going on. Lawsuits in the Puget Sound region were brought by environmental groups saying that there was a real problem in the salmon world, that there was a salmon crisis. Several books and articles were written about it in the early 1990s. And that precipitated in watershed planning, local governments getting involved, trying to be part of the solution to save salmon on the habitat side of the equation, but it was too little too late.
So in the early 90s, and as wild salmon populations were on the decline, and people started looking into what were the cause of these declines, they came up with what we refer to as the 4 H's. Hatcheries, harvest, habitat, and hydro. Those were the main causative factors that were grouped as for the decline of our salmon populations?
It's the result of everything. It's the result of where we put our roads, how we've harvested our trees and forests, where we built parking lots. It's the result of the way that we managed hatcheries and which fish stocks we used and when we released them. It's the result of who's been harvesting what, where, and how. And it's the result of all of those things simultaneously over the last 120 years, really.